Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 5th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Thank you for spending your mornings here with us every morning. I was thinking about that. We really appreciate you being here. With that, let's go ahead and jump into the Beltway. Robert, good morning. Let's start off with Democrats. Last month, Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, implied that Democrats were going to take a harder line stance against Republicans in Congress. And he said they have to use exceptional tactics. Are we going to see Democrats here try to tank Republican efforts to fund the government? What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. Well, that seems to be what Hakeem Jeffries is saying. This was an interview over the weekend where he said that Democrats are, quote, committed to doing everything they can to prevent Republicans. He specifically from passing this budget reconciliation bill, the one that is going to fund a lot of Trump's legislative priorities. I think this is also in line with what Chris Murphy said, where they're going to, and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, that they're going to block these spending bills that are due by 30 September in order to try to get concessions and, what they call bipartisan bills. I also saw that there was an interview with Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco over the weekend. And she pointed out what seems to be the strategy here is that Democrats are going to focus on a thematic issue that she said got them the House to flip the House in 2018. And in 2018, it was Obamacare. And to me, it looks like what they're focusing on now is cuts to entitlements like Medicaid, Social Security, and due process rather than focusing on immigration itself, because that seems to be a third rail for Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to get too far into this, but I record all the Sunday news shows, and the Republicans on there are telling these people, we're not going to cut Medicare. We're not going to cut Medicaid. No one's coming after your Social Security. And then the Democrats get on there and they say, they're going after your Medicare. They're going after your Social Security. It seems to be like, I don't know. I guess if you're in the middle, maybe you're not real sure who to trust. Let's move on to DHS. Looks like they're going to put CISA back on their core mission. What's going on?
This is from Homeland Secretary Kristi Noem, and she said the Trump administration is going to focus on getting CISA back onto its core mission of critical infrastructure, cyber defense, because she said that CISA has strayed from this mission, especially during the Biden administration. And they're also going to focus on reducing some of these information sharing burdens on the private sector and push a lot of the cybersecurity responsibility and liability down to the state and local level. I think Noem's obviously referencing some of the actions the Biden administration had CISA engage in, like online censorship and what they call malinformation, which might explain some of the loss of focus that has allowed Chinese hackers to accelerate their presence on U.S. networks.
Mm-hmm. Now, I forget that Nina Jankowicz, she was proposed to lead some countering misinformation agency or whatever it was. Was that under CISA?
I want to say yes, that was under CISA.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I think that's a fantastic example. All right. And then also coming up in Congress today, there's a hearing on DHS restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese entities of concern. Apparently, there's a bill making its way through Congress. By the way, I didn't read the text of the bill, but I did see in the abstract that some of these Confucius Institutes, some of these universities could continue receiving funding through a waiver, which is interesting. All right. And then let's move on here to ICE. This is very interesting to me. So there's a headline I read this morning. It's there on the bottom of your screen. This is from India Today. Indians abandoned their children at U.S. border for citizenship. It's on Trump radar now. And that is exactly what this article goes on to describe. Indian media is reporting that the practice of Indian parents abandoning their children on the U.S. border may soon end due to changes in U.S. immigration policy. And what this article describes, and again, this is in Indian media, what this article describes is Indian parents leaving their children on the border in hopes that the children will be taken in by Customs and Border Patrol or ICE and granted citizenship. From 2022 to 2025, over 2,500 unaccompanied Indian children were left on the U.S.-Mexico or U.S.-Canada borders, or were intercepted by U.S. Immigrations and Custom Enforcement. And sometimes the parents had already illegally immigrated to the U.S., and then they would pay to have their children brought into the country. In other cases, parents hoped that the children would be granted U.S. citizenship, and then they could file the paperwork to have themselves admitted under some family reunification program or on humanitarian grounds. According to an ICE internal document that was obtained by a pro-immigration group, ICE is seeking to deport unaccompanied minors or file criminal charges against their adult sponsors. So basically, if you're an Indian parent, you leave your kid on the border, the kid gets brought into the United States, you come into the United States, and then you file for sponsorship to get your kids back, you could be arrested. According to ICE, 170 illegal aliens have so far been arrested after applying to become sponsors for these unaccompanied minors. Also, DHS is conducting these welfare checks on unaccompanied minors that are already in the United States in order to ensure they're not being trafficked or exploited. If you remember, that was a big deal under Biden. Presumably, that's still going on at some level, although DHS is trying to stop that now. Pro-immigration groups say these checks are really just intelligence gathering missions to find family members that may be linked with transnational criminal organizations. So the Trump administration is trying to end two things here. Number one, ending the child first chain migration loophole, which I previously described. And then the second thing is the previous practice of leaving unaccompanied minors in dubious living arrangements with possible human traffickers. I'm sure there are some cases of confirmed human traffickers there as well. Activists say this policy will be challenged in the federal courts. So there's another large federal injunction coming up, I presume. And there already is a legal fight underway because the Department of Health and Human Services has previously cut funding for legal services for unaccompanied minors. And apparently there's a federal judge who is trying to get that program refunded. All right, let's go ahead and move on here to the next, to our roll-ups. Robert, good morning again. We'll let you take over here with what's the Justice Department is going after some states. What's going on?
Yeah, last week the DOJ filed lawsuits against Hawaii and Michigan, and these are over some of these suits that these states have filed against fossil fuel companies over what they call climate change harms. They also filed complaints against New York and Vermont over what are called climate super funds. I think we've covered previously. Basically, they fine these fossil fuel companies and utilities, put it into a general fund for the state to ostensibly pay for the harms of climate change. And the Justice Department said that this is not only harming the ability for the U.S. to produce energy, but is also aiding U.S. adversaries. And then the Trump administration is also suing Colorado and Denver specifically over the sanctuary policies. And they said in this lawsuit that the sanctuary policies are impeding federal immigration enforcement. And they asked the court to rule that the sanctuary policies are unconstitutional. So I think the Trump administration is now, I think the reason why they're suing Colorado and Denver is they may have found a venue they think is amenable to their argument, and they want to create precedent they can use to strike down other sanctuary city policies. I think this is likely an attempt to force these sanctuary states and cities to knock it off, basically, before like we talked about last week, the potential that the Trump administration is sort of ramping up military enforcement of the law and immigration enforcement in these sanctuary areas. And then finally, Joint Task Force Alpha, which is part of the Department of Justice, said they arrested 4 Mexican nationals that were smuggling hundreds of aliens per week across the U.S.-Canada border. And they said that this was part of what they're calling Operation Take Back America.
Mm-hmm. All right. So is this the case where these groups have just shifted to the Canadian border because there's so much focus on the southern border?
I think that's part of it. That's also a lot of the fentanyl, for example, is kind of downplayed because the CBP will report only, they recovered tens of pounds of fentanyl, or relatively small amounts compared to the Mexican border. But I think there is a shift of illegal alien smuggling to the northern border due to just how expansive it is, how low the monitoring is compared to the southern border. And then a lot of the drug trade already exists in Canada, but as far as I understand, it's hard to look into because there's a lot of cooperation with some of the trucking companies, especially ones owned by foreign-born Canadian residents that are smuggling a lot of this stuff across the border.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and bring Jared on. Jared, good morning. I'll let you take it from the top.
Good morning. We'll start off here in the State Department. So the State Department designated the Vive Ensemble Group and the Grand Griff Gang as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. Both of these organizations are Haitian, with the Vive Ensemble being a coalition of gangs. And this designation, per the State Department, allows the U.S. to cut members and affiliates off of the financial system and seize any of their assets that are actually here in the United States. And I think this is actually intended to be kind of a 1-2 punch against the Haitian immigration we saw under the Biden administration, because we saw the CHNV revocation. That was the basically a protective status for Haitians, among others. And at the same time, this will allow them to deport and potentially seize all of any Haitian gang members that could have come here. And if they manage to actually, mitigate some of this gang activity, it reduces the likelihood of a recognizable refugee claim or asylum claim. On the diplomatic front, Iran's foreign minister is stopping into Pakistan in order to meet with his Pakistani counterpart and discuss de-escalating tensions with India. Pakistan continues to say that they're not going to escalate despite the Indians drying out the Chenab River, and which we've seen. I've had posts on the map quite a bit recently. And Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, is actually continuing on for a pre-scheduled meeting in India for the Joint Economic Commission. I expect he'll probably meet with S. Jaishankar or maybe even the Indian foreign minister to see about de-escalating the tensions there. And the Iranian foreign minister is actually the first diplomat to show up in person for this. So, and I think it's worth noting that they're probably the only powerful nation in the region that doesn't actually have a declared side. Russia largely aligns with India, ironically, China with Pakistan, us with India. Here, Iran's actually fairly neutral. Staying on Iran, the Israeli prime minister promised to retaliate against Iran for a Houthi attack on Israel's main international airport. Iran promised that any U.S. military action, which would basically being involved in that Israeli attack, would result in retaliatory attacks on U.S. bases in the region. I think the big thing here is that this is going to affect the nuclear negotiations we've seen going on. And
hey, just a point of clarification. Yeah, that missile attack, it may have been targeting the airport, but it actually landed outside the airport.
Oh, thank you. Everything I was saying that it hit the airport. So
yeah,
thank you. All right. So staying in Israel, Turkey and Israel confirmed that Turkish jets jammed Israeli jets sent to strike Syria over the weekend. And Turkish officials are called on Israel to cease any airstrikes in Syria and to understand the jamming as a warning. This is very important because electronic attack jamming is actually considered an act of war. Had to be pretty familiar with that while I was back on the ship. And lastly, Japan's finance minister announced yesterday that Japan would not use its U.S. Treasury holdings as a negotiating tool in the tariffs. Basically, it will not weaponize them at all. Obviously, this is a show of goodwill, but Japan remains the largest Treasury holder largest foreign Treasury holder for the United States bonds.
Yes. Yeah, I think the largest holder is the Fed, followed by it may be Japan, or U.S. households is somewhere in second or third there. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on here to these Antifa demonstrations, or the lack of Antifa demonstrations. As of this morning, I cannot find any reliable reports covering direct action demonstrations by Antifa over the May Day weekend protests. And that ran from Thursday of last week through Sunday. Over, I think, Indivisibles in May Day Strong were counting over 1,000 individual protests. Otherwise, I think pretty lackluster. A lack of media coverage of destructive Antifa activity is not uncommon. Actually, it's probably more common than not that media outlets just don't cover it. However, social media accounts do typically pick up on these activities and provide images or sometimes videos, at least descriptions. In this case, there has been a lack of social media coverage and also lack of blog reporting. And I think that's a good sign of negligible amounts of Antifa activity over May Day. It is unclear. There was in Tacoma, these anarchists were publicizing this rolling economic blockade. I'm not even sure if that happened. I couldn't find it in news anywhere. It is possible. It's actually not uncommon for Antifa days later to come out and claim, kind of once the dust settles, to come out and say, yeah, hey, we did this a week ago, or we did this a few nights ago. And they claim the attack after it happens for, obviously it's an operation security measure. However, it looks like these groups are still either inactive or maybe rebuilding on the sidelines of the anti-Trump protest movement. I've been very careful not to overestimate far left activity or capabilities. And there's a huge surge of, I think, expectations, especially on social media, like, oh, Antifa is going to launch another Summer of Love, and here it comes, and they're going to start suicide bombing Chick-fil-A, and it's going to be the Summer of Love 2.0 on steroids. And, I've pushed back on that since starting last year. I was telling people, listen, I see them canceling events. There's no way they're going to go riot if Trump wins. And there's just been this whole media ecosystem about, oh, Antifa riots. Antifa's going to riot for the Trump election. And they're going to riot for the inauguration. Then they're going to riot on May Day, and this is it. And guys, I'm just not seeing it. Point being, I've been extremely careful not to overestimate or kind of play into that false narrative. But it looks like even I expected too much from these Antifa groups on May Day, which is an important point. So I think kind of my expectation is that they're still rebuilding. I think they have really struggled to gain the amount of support, obviously, that they had in 2020. They've been canceling events. I've talked just briefly. I've talked about this several times before. Every July, well, almost every July, there's an event called F the 4th. I won't say it on the show, but they use the F word. And, it's kind of like a middle finger direct action against the 4th of July and Independence Day. And it was canceled last year. Even it was canceled in Seattle and Portland, I think, because not enough people were going to show up. And so these groups are struggling to gain traction. And I guess it's going to be in the indefinite future at this point. But I will continue to monitor and report. With that, let's go ahead and move on here. Robert, all right. We just saw this grid failure, essentially, or energy failure in Spain and Portugal that was blamed on green energy. And this is interesting because it looks like the United States is, because of the Obama and Biden era energy plans, it looks like we are maybe falling into the same trap at some point in the future. What's going on?
So there was some data published by this clean energy think tank called Ember, and I looked through their spreadsheet, and it shows that in March of 2025, the U.S. surpassed 50% of electricity generated by green energy sources or renewable energy sources. Robert Rapier, he's the founder of R Squared Energy. And he said this data, he said that we're likely to see a rebound of fossil fuel generation during the summer as power demand increases. But he said that this data shows a clear trajectory of increased green energy generation in the future, which I think also fits the Energy Information Administration's projections. So this projections from 2020, they didn't include a projection in their long-term 2025 outlook that was recently released. But they estimated in 2020 that 41% of U.S. electricity would be generated by renewables. However, that does not take into account the Biden era Clean Power Plan 2.0 and all of these utilities saying that this was driving coal power plants and even some gas power plants out of business. In the Spain and Portugal example, reportedly they get more than 70% of their electricity from green energy sources, and I think this points to some type of tipping point for a proportion of green energy on the grid, increasing the risk of grid failure. Because the problem here is that all these renewables, the solar and wind specifically, they are direct currents electronically connected to the grid. They do not have power turbines and baseload power generation like coal, gas, and nuclear. They have power turbines. The reason why this is important is because those turbines ensure grid stability, because they can absorb excess power on the grid when demand is low, and they can increase demand. They can increase power on the grid when demand is high, and basically keep the system stable. I think in the Spain and Portugal example, the government has said officially that there was a group of lines down by a weather event, and that basically disrupted this balance, and they couldn't fix it because there weren't enough baseload power turbines to absorb the decreased demand, absorb the excess power. And I think if the Trump administration's efforts to reverse course on like the Clean Power Plan 2.0 and a lot of these green energy policies from the Obama and Biden eras, whether that's the Democrats flipping the House or Senate in 2026 or taking the White House in 2028, I think that puts the U.S. back on track for increasing grid fragility and a high risk of major disruptions.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very important point. There's just innumerable factors here that really show me that the base load, the so-called fossil fuel powered electricity generation is what we need for national security, as opposed to the green energy, which is, someone pointed this out the other day. Our grid as it operates today is modern, and it's not like this has hundreds of years of proven testing and reliability. And so, I guess we should just expect all these green energy grids to continue having major problems going into the future.
I think so, and I think in the U.S. obviously it's going to be regional dependent. A lot of these states in the Northeast, California, Hawaii, and some out west like Colorado that have these 100% clean energy mandates, I think are going to have it worse off. Their risk is going to be much higher, and the grids that they're connected to are going to be at a much higher risk than like Texas, for example, that has its own grid and doesn't have, like, they've grown a lot of green energy generation, but they're not shutting down fossil fuel generation like some of these other states are. And it does point out that there's two things about fossil fuel energy that makes it important for national security. One, it's transmissible or dispatchable. Two, it doesn't shut off at night or when the wind isn't blowing. And three, it does mechanically help balance power generation on the grid, so you don't run into these massive blackouts like Spain and Portugal saw last week.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Great point. Let's move on. Jared, let's have a look-see over here at the Saku Islands. These belong to Japan. China says, hey, not so fast. What's going on?
Yes, for the record, they've belonged to Japan since 1895 when Japan beat China in a war. So China summoned the Japanese ambassador to demand Japan stop invading the airspace over the Saku Islands after the Chinese Coast Guard warned off a Japanese civilian helicopter. The Chinese ambassador to Japan similarly accused his host nation, Japan, of conducting illegal activity over the Saku Islands. Now, we're going to get into why it's important here. Last year, the Chinese patrolled the Senkakus every single day using their Coast Guard. It was stated at the beginning, hey, we're going to do this, and they did it. And the Japanese reported on it every day. And it's now asserting governing authority over these Japanese-governed islands. I think China's likely trying to seize these Senkakus without firing a shot, because this would significantly enhance the effectiveness of any blockade that they would run, as one of the key trisecting island chains would be under Chinese control. As you can see on the map here, I've plotted roughly where the Chinese tend to put their forces and what kind of forces they use. They normally have a carrier strike group out in the Philippine Sea, which is their most important asset. They have a surface action group up north and down south. They would need a logistics chain through one of these sets of islands, either the Batanes or the Senkakus, both of which are highlighted. The Batanes are absolutely undisputed. Philippines owns them, and now there's a bunch of anti-ship missiles on them. The Senkakus are their best bet because they're not inhabited at all. They're just owned.
Doesn't the Japanese military or navy have outposts or something like a military base there?
They I think they've got one on one, or it might be right near it, but there's nothing permanent in those islands as a measure of respect for the fact that they are disputed between Taiwan, Japan, and China, all claiming those islands. It's just a measure of, hey, okay, we won't put anybody there. I strongly suspect Taiwan would be willing to say, okay, Japan, you can arm those islands in the event that China moves on us. But point is, China needs these islands if it's going to support its carrier strike group in the event of a blockade. However, I think what China's doing here will actually end up resulting in Japan arming these islands to prevent a Chinese fait accompli over it, basically saying, these are our islands. We've kind of doing a diplomatic squatters' rights move on it, saying we're here, it's ours now. Now, normally I wouldn't really be worried about this because the Chinese sometimes do some rather silly things, but I actually saw a very influential Japanese foreign serviceman. He used to be an ambassador, now is an advisor. He was calling his government to action over this, saying, no, you cannot allow them to just walk all over us for this, like you did for the Japanese child that was killed in China, because there was no diplomatic protest over that. So they do appear to be making this into a very important deal for Japanese and Chinese relations.
Mm-hmm. All right. So yeah, this dispute over the Senkakus is nothing new. The new thing is China is saying Taiwan belongs to us. The Senkakus belong to us. How much longer will it be before China says the Batanes Islands also belong to them?
As far as I know, they don't have an historic claim over that, so it would be a lot harder to do. But we've covered, it was probably over a month ago now, some of their propagandists, which they all get orders from on high, they were asserting dominance over everything from China down to the Tasmanian island south of Australia, claiming that we own all of this. This is all of our empire. Like, okay, so eventually they will. As far as when, I'm not quite sure. It may be that they treat it as effectively booty if they manage to actually capture Taiwan. They move on to the Batanes.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Batanes, that's part of the first island chain, correct?
Yes, they'd need to capture basically the entire first island chain.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's move on to your questions here. All right. Why would Israel allow the Chinese-operated Bayport in Haifa to be allowed to double its capacity? The Bayport is operated by Shanghai International Port Group, a Chinese state-owned company. I'm sure there's some kind of economic benefit here, Jared. I mean, why wouldn't you want a major port to have double capacity? Isn't that Israel's main port anyway? I
think so. Yeah, it's their largest Mediterranean port, if I remember right, and down in Eilat is I think that's how you pronounce it. Their access to the Red Sea, so might be competing for largest port there. Okay. As far as why though, yeah, it's economics, and Israel's been trying to cozy up with China for a long time, but China doesn't like to let Israel into China. Mm-hmm.
All right, let's move on to the next question. What do you think that Bondi is saving the Epstein Files for the 2026 midterms as ammo against the Democrats? I don't know. I know a whole lot of people aren't getting what they voted for. Pam Bondi, if you missed it over the weekend, I think Pam Bondi said that there's no timeline for her to release the Epstein Files, even though they've been dangling this out for a while now. Jared, Robert, other than she said a month or two ago, she said, "Oh, they're sitting on my desk. Like she just needs to sign off on them, and they'll be released." And then they did that weird thing where they brought in all these conservative influencers and they gave them the binders with, like, I guess, old information or something. I don't know. I didn't see anything come out of that. And apparently it's not the real list. I've seen people say Trump's name or in the Epstein Files. That's why he doesn't want them released, even though he says he will release them. Robert, what say you?
I think the most likely case is that there isn't anything other than what is already publicly known from the prior leaks before that stunt. And Bondi promised to release all this stuff, and probably Real got in and realized there isn't a list necessarily. The list is probably not in the FBI's evidence room. It's in somebody's floor wall safe if it still exists. I think is the most likely case. I think they just found out there isn't a list to release, and they don't want to admit that. Bondi specifically doesn't want to admit that.
Well, it seems like the longer she waits, the bigger the hole that's being dug.
I agree. Yeah, it's beginning. The angrier people are going to get, and then that just means they'll probably be even angrier when she does, if she does eventually say that this is all we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see Ben saying that, let's just say alternatively, it cuts too deep. And maybe that's why they don't want to release it. Hey, you know what? I've seen, it was years ago. It came out, someone leaked it or someone brought it to everyone's attention that there's a list of members of Congress, apparently some still active. They've used taxpayer money to pay these settlement lawsuits for like sexual harassment and, whatever, sexual assault, by members of Congress using taxpayer money to settle these, I guess, potentially multi-million-dollar settlement deals. We haven't seen that list either.
Yeah, I think we only know about it because of Matt.
Just give us all the lists.
I think we only know about that because of Matt Gaetz. He's the one that pointed that out when that ethics investigation started before he dropped out to be the potential AG. Yeah, and there's, if there is an Epstein list, there's probably some overlap there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to follow the Jocko Willink response to this when people say, "Oh, we're not going to see that list either because there are Republicans on there." Good. Let's just see the whole list. Let's see how dirty all this stuff actually is. All right. Thanks. Let's move on to the next question. How much of U.S. ag machinery and equipment is sourced from China? And should China trade shut down completely, how long would it take to impact U.S. ag output?
I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head, but it's not zero, I think. Yeah.
Let's see. I pulled this off of, I don't know, Goldman Sachs or something on Friday. I shared this with the Early Warning Network. Hey, by the way, one really good reason to join Early Warning Networks, because I show a bunch of this stuff over to members here. And I don't see ag machinery on this list. I'm sure it's somewhere, probably a lot. I mean, I think between the ag input, I would think the ag inputs like the chemicals are the big problem here.
Yeah, and that's the 2,4-D herbicide that farmers were warning about last week. The chemical stuff is a big input. Fertilizer, I think, is mostly Canada, and then there's some from Europe. But I think China also does have some fertilizer imports in the U.S. That's probably, fertilizer and herbicides are probably the two bigger problems for inputs than machinery. But yeah, I imagine it's not zero. Like John Deere probably does import some auto parts, and even if they import from Mexico, like automakers do, there is some percentage of that is passed through from China. I think Mexican auto plants, like some Mexican official a couple weeks ago pointed that out. Oh, and we found that 20% of our parts that we then import into the United States are actually coming from China. They're just relabeled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that probably also does not include all the subcontractors that say their stuff is made in the Philippines, but it's actually made in China. And they just get these subcomponents in. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. The next question here. How much of Antifa's lack of shenanigans is attributable to the fact that they seem to have lost most of their high cover from law enforcement? Honestly, I think this is, there are, probably 5 or 6 different reasons. They're all relevant factors why Antifa is not active today. One of those was that Georgia RICO case where I think 61 of Antifa militants / eco activists were arrested. A couple of them were charged under some kind of domestic terror statutes. It was a RICO case. I think that had a huge chilling effect. It was so bad. Even the Stop Cop City movement, they basically even shut down. They're like, I think Stop Cop City was in some level. I think they just hit some kind of new achievement here for the construction of that. If you'll remember, for several years, starting in like 2020 or 2021, the state of Georgia was building this Atlanta public safety training facility. It was a police training facility, and various community groups, black activists, Antifa, eco activists came out there, and they opposed it because they were clearing part of what they call the Atlanta forest, or I think it's called the Wilani Forest is what they called it. Basically clear cutting the forest to build this training center. And it was not just a training center, it was a complex of other types of buildings. And so these activist groups went out and they occupied it, and they chained themselves up to the trees, and they chained themselves to construction equipment, and they lit a bunch of stuff on fire. I mean, they burned up a lot of construction vehicles and bulldozers and trucks and all sorts of stuff. Actually, it was so bad. I think one of the main construction companies actually pulled out, because that may have been Brassfield and Gordy, because they were tired of having all their trucks burned up. So at any rate, 61% of these, or 61 people were arrested and charged with RICO. I think that had a huge effect. In the summer of 2024, we also saw Portland Police Bureau Chief Mike Day come out and describe some of the tactics that Portland Police Department was taking against Antifa. You know, you read through that stuff and you're like, this is pretty basic counterinsurgency stuff. So I think, yeah, law enforcement, this is a huge reason, I think, why we're not seeing more Antifa activity. Law enforcement is arresting these people, and in some cases, they're being let go. In most cases, they're not being let go. They are facing charges. So how much? Probably most. But also these people are just, they're 4 years older, they're 8 years older, they're in a different part of life. Maybe they're married to a Zim or a Zur, maybe they're in a throuple, and going out and riding just does not have the same draw that it did when they were younger. All right, next question. I think this is the last one for today. How would the Shiloh, was it Shiloh Hendricks GoFundMe and surrounding debacle is going to alter the 2026 to 2028? I'll be honest. I don't know. I think this is I would say it's a milestone, but I don't actually think this is like going to have any kind of structural impact to where we are in 26 or 28. I will say, I see the white identity movement as, I think, solidifying around this. They had something like, I think 17. Okay, listen, if you're not familiar with this, Shiloh Hendricks was this lady. She was at the park. Apparently, this kid, they said he's 5 years old. I guess he's probably not 5 years old. But this black kid, 5 years old, goes into her baby's bag, or she's at a playground, remember. Some black 5-year-old kid goes over and like roots around in her bag, maybe stealing stuff, I don't know. And she calls him the N-word, and then the cell phones get broken out and this guy's recording. And apparently this guy's like actually a pedophile that's recording this whole thing. What in the world is he doing at a playground in the first place? I've not seen enough people ask that question. At any rate, and so it goes viral, and a bunch of white people come out and give money to her because they're going after her life, whatever. I don't think that has any kind of structural impact. I think that's an accelerator, but I don't think it's anything beyond that. I think this is going to be a footnote in history, not any kind of like culminating event or anything like that, obviously. I'm not actually sure that's going to have any impact on 26 to 28 at all, other than just as an accelerant. Just, it is another event that we might look back on in years past and say, oh yeah, this was an important point that fueled identitarian politics in the United States, or race-based collectivism in the United States. I think that's all it is. And by the way, it may not be over. Apparently, the state of Minnesota may be after this lady next. I don't know. If that's the case, then it's going to give a little longevity to this whole thing. But I don't think it's anything. I don't think it's a trigger. At most, it's an accelerant. All right, listen, and that's my take. Robert, Jared, I don't know. This really doesn't have much intelligence value per se. But do you have any other takes on this?
From what I've seen, the Minnesota state is actually going after her, and a lot of the activists have been calling CPS, Child Protective Services, on her, which Child Protective Services doesn't need evidence per se. It needs you to believe that there is a danger to the child in order to start the investigation. That's probably going to end up being just an inconvenience, but nevertheless, that is a kind of a use of lawfare. And I do think that I think the entire situation is much more of a metric for how things are going rather than accelerator trigger for anything like that. It was interesting to see that everybody on both sides was doing a comparison between the Hendricks issue and the Carmelo Anthony issue. They were comparing how much funding was raised for each side.
Mm-hmm. All right, Robert, any closing shots here?
Yeah, I agree. It's not a trigger event, though. My concern long term, if this is an accelerant, is domestic strife. Like that was at the beginning of the year when you asked us like what our biggest long term concerns are, and mine was pullback basically of local authority. Like a lot of these local state level authorities kind of ceding ground basically because they can't enforce the law everywhere all at once, every square mile. And maybe this contributes to an increase in domestic, violent incidents, not drastically, but enough that state, local law enforcement kind of pulls back a little bit on, like we've seen previously. And then you start to have a loss of legal authority or the perception of legal legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, great point. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing, which is ending, but the show goes on over on the Early Warning Network app. You can access it via your smartphone or via the web like I do. Head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Sign up for a free 7-day trial to our news and intelligence platform. We got thousands of people sharing information. They're all throughout the day. And we'd love to have you over there. We've built a community around this early warning product. And the goal is to connect people, not just online, but in meet space, in real life as well. All right. With that, we'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.